Scripture comes from Micah and Amos. Start with Micah 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Would you take just a moment to check your pulse? Just a moment. Feel your pulse, beating of your heart, coursing life-giving blood through our bodies. Our hearts beating, 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 going, going, going. It's the heart of the matter. The heart, the center, the essence is what's important. For the last several weeks, I've been inviting us to think about knowing the heart of God. And today we hear two different texts from two different prophets of Israel from a long time ago. And both of them seem to focus on a common theme: justice. Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Actually, both Hebrew words mean justice. Let justice roll down like waters and justice like an ever-flowing stream. And then the prophet Micah, what does God require? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Justice, mercy, humility. Rather simple. But both the prophets, Amos, Micah, if you read Isaiah and some of the other prophets, they spend quite a bit of time talking about the emptiness of ritual, of doing the right practice, of trying to appease God, and say that it's the heart that makes a difference. It's what moves us from the essence of our being that makes a difference. And Micah focuses right in and says, what ought the heart to be like? But to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. These are all three important. Let's start with humility. It's the easiest. Yes, it is. Great response. Great response. Thank you. Yeah, it really is, because we build humility up in some sort of thing that it's not. Humility is simple. All humility is be the person God created you to be. That's it. That's what humility is. Accepting and being the person God created you to be. That's humility. Now, if we think that we're better than someone or better than others, that's not humility. However, if we think we're worse than anyone or others, that's not humility either. Humility is simply being. Now, what about justice and mercy? I think in modern society, particularly the church, and maybe even our church, we confuse the two. And we say, oh, well, they're the same thing. But they're not. Mercy is having compassion, caring for the other, meeting a need. Justice is changing the system, making things better, making things different. One of my favorite stories comes from a preacher, writer, Bruce Larson. In one of his little devotional books, he has this great story. He said he and his wife had moved to a very small apartment. They invited some good friends to come visit for the weekend, and they thought, well, they would treat their friends to a special thing, so they put them up in a very, very fancy hotel. Now, to show you how old this story book is, he said it was so fancy it had a telephone in the bathroom. Now, some of you aren't old enough to really get that, okay? But it was really an exclusive, swanky hotel. And they thought, we'll treat our friends to this. So the next morning, after the first night their friends spent the night, he went to the hotel to pick them up, and they were going to go someplace together as a family. So as he walked in, he grabbed the door handle to the hotel door and said after he walked in, he noticed he cut his hand badly. So the blood was just gushing out. So he quickly grabbed his hand, ran up to the desk where he was going to go and asked them to phone his friend's room. And he said, I cut my hand, can you help me? He said he was amazed. 3 young women behind the counter instantly brought out a rag. They got it wet, they cleaned it, they wiped it off, they had antiseptic, they had ointment, they had bandages. He said, they fixed me up in no time flat. He said, I said to them, wow, you ladies are impressive. Can't believe you fixed my hand so quickly and so efficiently. And they said, oh, yeah, you're the third one to do it today. Yeah. Now, mercy is fixing somebody's hand. Justice is fixing the door. How many times have we as human beings, and we as the church, failed to fix the door? Now, some of you are sitting back, maybe steeling yourselves a bit, saying, okay, now, John's off on this rant about justice. He's got these prophets all lined up behind him, and you know, we know this peacenik, liberal-loving, semi-whatever he is. He's going to let us have it about all this justice making. Yeah, well, however, we've been talking about knowing the heart of God. I began to ask, God expects us. What does the Lord require? Justice, mercy, humility. I ask, does God expect the same thing of God's self? If God expects us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, does God expect the same of God? If we're going to know the heart of God, then we might want to figure out the answer to the question. It's quite easy for me to simply say, this God out there somewhere, or this entity, or this essence, or whatever, however you understand God, requires that I do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with this God. But if I know the heart of God, does God do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? I think a lot of us have probably been influenced, if we have any history with Christian or Jewish faith, to understand, well, God is a powerful being to be worshipped, to be served, to be glorified. And yet, if we read the text carefully and hear God's heart described as creating, permission-giving, creating, recreating, renewing, forgiving, changing God's mind, invitational. If we really begin to know God's heart, then we know God is one who walks in humility. If you need a text, I can give you one. It comes from an ancient song of the church. An old hymn that the Apostle Paul quotes in the 2nd chapter of the letter to the church at Philippi, Philippians 2, where Paul writes an ancient hymn saying, "But Jesus, even though in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped and clung to, but willingly emptied himself, taking on human likeness and becoming human even to the point of death on the cross." Oh my goodness sakes, our God is a humble, vulnerable, loving God. So I say, if we want to know God's heart, then maybe the best image we can have is to look at the gift of Jesus Christ, at least in our tradition. Jesus came in humility as God with us. And we definitely know Jesus was a person of mercy. He offered forgiveness. He offered healing. He offered new life, recovery of sight. Oh, yes, mercy was a part of the essence of who we understand Jesus to be. Merciful, caring, compassionate. We can see that. We may have a more difficult time seeing Jesus living out God's justice, however. But I think that's because we have a hard time with justice in general. But Jesus lived out justice rather dramatically, but also rather quietly. Quietly, Jesus lived out justice in being a subversive sage, as Marcus Ford likes to talk about him. Have you read any of Jesus' stories lately? I mean, they're crazy. They turn everything upside down. One of the most appropriate ways to deal with injustice is to upset the status quo. Now, you may not like that, but one of the quickest ways to deal with injustice is to upset the status quo. Injustice happens more often when we say, oh, well, let's just go along to get along. But Jesus also practiced justice by standing up to the powers of Rome, of religion, of common, everyday wisdom. Jesus practiced mercy, but his justice can readily be seen in the people for whom Jesus extended mercy. Typically not the wealthy, not the well-to-do, not the powerful, but the least of these. What does God require? Justice, mercy, and humility. I'm probably bothered by these because I want to be one of those people that can change the world. I mean, I want to change the world. I mean, I'm going to make peace happen this afternoon. Okay? I want to end up in income equality by 5 o'clock tonight. I want to transform the world. And I've kind of lived long enough now, I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. And yet at the same time I hear God's call. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. How are you and I going to do that? I can't manufacture it on my own. I sometimes say, well, you ought to be doing more, John. You ought to be doing less. You ought to not do this. You ought to do that. I think of all these things that I could, should, ought to be doing. And yet sometimes I forget the most important thing. If you would you take a moment to check your pulse? In that video of the young woman who invited her father's heart transplant recipient to come walk her down the aisle, did you notice she reached over to feel his pulse? Or he asked her to. How many people are medical personnel? Okay, you notice she did it wrong. You can't take somebody's pulse with your thumb. Because then you feel your own. But she wanted to know her father's heartbeat. She wanted something of her father in that moment. Well, if I'm going to practice doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, I need to know God's heartbeat. It's the same process as taking our own. If you're going to take your pulse, you've got to stop what you're doing. I mean, trust me, when I used to run, I tried to take my pulse while I was running. I mean, okay, Apple Watches, you're exempt. But I used to try to take my pulse while I was running. You at least have to walk, or I did. If you're going to take your pulse, you have to slow down and stop. You've got to focus. You've got to pay attention. If we're going to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God, we're going to have to take some time, prayer, meditation, quiet reflection, to take God's pulse, pay attention, to experience God, and to know God's overwhelming love is with us. Because in the end, there is not a thing you or I can think, do, or say to make God love us any less. There's not a thing you and I can think, do, or say to make God love us any more. Knowing the heart of God is knowing